Okay. And hello and welcome everyone. So first things first, we have a quiz going right now. It's same as all the other quizzes before it. This is just 5 questions. Probably should only take you about 10 minutes to answer, and they're all multiple choice. So just you have until tomorrow night at 11:59 p.m. and don't forget to do it. It helps your grade quite a bit if you do it. And there's not going to be any late takers or anything. So don't forget about that. So on Tuesday, since we're a bit staggered right now in terms of our schedule, because they gave a holiday for voting, the today's lecture will actually be split in two between this and next week, because this is supposed to be a week-long lecture, but we have to deal with that. And hold on a second while I hit screen share. There we go. So let's get that to be just me. There we go. Yeah. All right. So today we're talking about the sectional crisis. The sectional crisis. Hold on a second. Dang it. Did you admit him, Kevin? I saw somebody who was asking to be admitted, and I do not see.
I admitted him.
Okay, cool. I tried to click on that and it disappeared immediately. Oh, there we go. Told you that as soon as you sent that link, people would start coming over. Anyways, the we've been talking about this kind of building tension over slavery throughout pretty much the entire semester, leading to a split in sections. Now, we've talked about sectionalism quite a bit already, but just to refresh you, the sections mean north, south, and west. But especially right now, we're talking about the north versus the south. But you also have a weird section in between called the border states. These are states that border free states but are slave states and are less reliant on slavery, but are still a major part of it. Especially, they're the ones who are fighting with the northern states over runaway slaves. Remember, we've talked about how runaway slaves keep on causing conflict. And the border states are where that conflict is. So going into this, there's already a lot of tension, but it didn't really cause that much friction at the national level until after the Mexican-American War, because we will see that all of that new territory, the organized territory in Oregon after the whole treaty there, and then the annexation of Texas and the Mexican cession, caused a great deal of tension over the question of slavery. Specifically, would slavery extend into it? With Texas, it was pretty much it was guaranteed that it would be that that slavery would be there, because according to the Missouri Compromise, that land was to be slave state land, and that's why the top of Texas has that little cut with Oklahoma, or at that time it was called the neutral strip, um, being separate, because that neutral strip was free, free soil, but it was also no man's land, that nobody was allowed to live there. So mostly Kiowas were around there, Kiowas and Comanches, um, and kind of protected from settlers simply because of this debate, although they certainly raided into settlements, and that caused friction as well. Um, so from the end of the Mexican-American War, you can see the roots of what would become the Civil War. But throughout from 1848 all the way to 1861 is called the Sectional Crisis, because you didn't really know where everything was going to be going. And you know, fighting over whether or not slavery's extension wasn't necessarily going to lead to the Civil War. Um, Remember, history is not something that is inevitable. There's there's always contingency. But by the end, especially with what's pictured on screen, that's a painting of John Brown, a famous abolitionist, like a militant abolitionist that we will be talking about quite a bit. Um, that the extension of slavery had to be fought, and people like John Brown were its militants. So to get a bit of a lay of the of what all of this entailed, um the the uh remember we were talking about like the Missouri Compromise and all that. You can see right there the give me the pointer. You can see right here, this is where Texas's northern boundary is, and that is according to the 1820 Missouri Compromise. See, um, Oklahoma extends a little bit north of it to incorporate the neutral strip. But Oklahoma wouldn't be created until the late 19th century, and for the most part, it's what's called Indian Territory. Now you can see by 1846, there's really no northern states that are slave states. Um, something to keep in mind is that a lot of these states had gradual abolition. So, for instance, the first one to pass gradual abolition was Pennsylvania in 1780, but they actually wouldn't be fully rid of slavery until 1847. So, some of these states that are like, not slave states still have some form of slavery, or are just barely over it. It's these more Western ones that are that have no slavery to begin with. Remember, the Northwest Ordinance said that there would be no slavery within the Northwest Territory. So all of these right here are part of the Northwest Territory in 1800. But as they gain statehood, technically states can decide whether or not to be slave states. It's their right to choose. And so there was a concerted effort of trying to extend slavery into these, but that failed. And you could see even in 1846, when Iowa was added, that there's still a slave state south and a free state north, even as it starts to extend westward into what was originally the Louisiana Purchase. Um, so you have all of that, and then we gain all this territory for sure. Remember, this was kind of disputed at that time, and down here was Mexico. But as a result of the Mexican American War, we gained all of this territory as well. And so by 1861, at the end of this lecture, which will actually be on Tuesday, um, we have a very different balance. Um, you know, Suddenly there's all this extra territory um, that is slave state territory, and that includes you can't see it because of the legend here, but that also includes Utah territory as well. Both Utah and New Mexico territory enacted slave codes. New Mexico became a slave territory, a legal slave territory. It had slavery all along in the form of Indian slavery. And in fact, one of the first people to wander through this territory was a slave who relayed the information about, the seven cities of gold and everything. So slavery had played a key role in New Mexico's history from its very beginning. But Utah also um, legalized it in 1853, so you can't really see that. That we'll be seeing that there's a huge fight over Kansas and Nebraska here, whether or not they would be um, slave territories. And also California kind of starts breaking the Missouri Compromise, because notice it's below, a good chunk of it is below that Missouri line, and yet it went free soil. So you could see the extension of slavery becomes a key issue throughout the 1850s. And that started even before gaining the all that extra territory, because in 1846, as the Mexican American War was starting to need more appropriations for more money for the war effort, a writer by a Senator Wilmot on a House bill to fund the war was put in that would state that none of the new territories would have slavery. This was seen as kind of just extending the whole idea of the Northwest Ordinance. Though one thing to note is, going back here, we can see many, like for instance, Arkansas and well, this wasn't called Mississippi at the time, but it was called the Southwest Territory. It was basically a good chunk of Alabama and Mississippi. Both of those were territories that actually had legal slavery. So there's arguments on both sides as to whether or not slavery is legal in these in territories, whether or not, and also whether or not the founding fathers would have preferred a slavery to extend itself. That a lot of this argument will come down to, like, what did the founding fathers want? And Wilmot obviously argued that they didn't want the extension of slavery. Problem is, that also would have canceled out the Missouri Compromise. And so that writer was soundly defeated, but he reintroduced it every single year of the war. So in 1847, he reintroduced it, and in 1848, it was reintroduced as part of the treaty stipulations for completing the war. All of these attempts failed, but you can see there's already a argument forming over this stuff. And remember last time we were talking about how Texas was organizing to invade New Mexico, and that led to a compromise. Well, um, that compromise was actually a lot bigger than just between Texas and New Mexico. It involved all of the new territories, so um, Utah, New Mexico, and California. Problem is, California was ultimately the one to actually break the Missouri Compromise, um, because California had organized in 1849 and presented its own state constitution to the federal government, and it had been ordered into existence because realized from 1847 all the way until late 1849. Um, the California was under direct military supervision, and that's during the gold rush. The 49ers and everything were coming in while it was still a military government. Um, and so the admiral in charge, a guy named Sloat, um, literally ordered California into existence as a state. So he ordered the what's called a constituent assembly, as in um, who comes in to organize a constitution. And this constituent assembly met in Monterey, California, and you know said that they wouldn't be a slave state in the Constitution, but that ultimately broke the Missouri Compromise. So there was that, plus what to do with New Mexico and Utah. And so the idea was, why don't we just leave it up to them? Why don't we say they can do this? But lots of senators were saying, no, territories are not supposed to territories are not supposed to be able to dictate whether or not they can have slavery. That is up to the federal government. And also, the founding fathers did not believe in the extension of slavery. And this led to a huge split in the country throughout all of this debate. People were becoming adamant that slavery should extend itself according to the Missouri Compromise. And so in Nashville, Tennessee, a group of 9 slave states sent delegates to argue over what to do about this situation, that they wanted the extension of slavery, but didn't believe Congress was going to go their way. And so the Nashville Convention actually advised that if slavery was not to be extended, to secede from the Union. And this was in June, from the 3rd of June to the 11th of June, 1850. So right at the beginning, we're already seeing the South talking about seceding over slavery. And yet it did go their way. It went towards the Compromise of 1850 said that California would be admitted as a free state. Texas did not have control over the southeast portion of basically the eastern portion of what is today New Mexico. They were arguing that they had control over that, even though they'd never established it. So New Mexico managed to keep a sovereign status, but was made a territory rather than a state, because New Mexico actually had enough people in it, according to the Northwest Ordinance, to become a state, but would be relegated to territorial status, which remind you means that the federal government has basically complete control over the territory, and anything enacted by the territorial legislature can be overruled by the governor, who is appointed by the president, um, or by Congress, by an act of Congress. So it basically made New Mexico into a subservient position. Same thing happened in Utah. Remember, that's Mormon led, and um, the there they had been trying to organize the Deseret Territory, and that failed spectacularly because of the Compromise of 1850. So the actual territorial bounds um, of the Southwest had been formulated by the Compromise of 1850, but there were other issues at hand. Um, First and foremost is that there's still that conflict over fugitive slaves, over runaway slaves, um, because up until this point, for slave catchers to come into the North and catch slaves, they had to petition the local government, that, or whatever town the slave was in or anything, and say, no, this is my property, this is not a free person. um, I own them, and therefore give them to me to transport back into slavery. You can understand that was a bit of that a lot of courts would find ways of getting around that in the North, that they would basically protect these runaway slaves by making legal arguments as to, oh, well, you didn't fill out this paperwork or whatever. They just made it a bureaucratic nightmare for a lot of these slave owners. So the slave owners had been constantly either coming up north to deal with that, or they just kidnap the supposed slave and take him back. That's how, like, if you guys have seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, the that's Solomon Northup, the protagonist of that movie. In fact, I think you guys are supposed to read a section of that as part of this class. Um, but the he was kidnapped as part of this process, even though he was definitely a freeman. Um, but the problem was that people, you know, didn't really care. They see a bunch of people attacking a black man on the street and just assume that that's de rigueur. So because of this ambiguity that actually stems all the way back to the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution has a fugitive slave clause, basically saying that any kind of contractor, unfree labor is to be regarded as sacrosanct between the states. Um, but it didn't say how that was to be enforced. And so part of the Compromise of 1850, basically to allow California to come in and kind of upset the slave-free balance, um, was the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act um, did a lot more than the previous one of 1793. The 1793 one put the onus on enforcing, on catching slaves completely on the slave owners or the slave owner's state. So it didn't require any local enforcement in the North. What this did was, well, force it on the North. That's why a lot of Northerners called it the Bloodhound Bill, because it gave Southerners access to the North in a really different way, because suddenly there was federal funding to force Northern law enforcement to become slave catchers themselves, even though they had, up until this point, practically acted as opposition to slave owners. Hold on, we got somebody meeting in. There we go. And so the the Fugitive Slave Act um, forced northern courts in that to work with Southerners in terms of um, the catching slaves, but it also gave impetus to U.S. Marshals to enforce slavery, to catch slaves that might be going into these new territories for freedom. Um, and so U.S. Marshals were forced to be part of this system through this Fugitive Slave Act. You can see how the Compromise of 1850 is kind of both good for anti-slavery folks, but also kind of a little bit better for pro-slavery folks, especially with the next part, which was giving popular sovereignty to Utah and New Mexico. Now, popular sovereignty was typically interpreted to only be given to states, that states were allowed to make their own decisions. But with the admission of California and upsetting the free slave state balance, the California had effectively said that they were going to be a free state before they had become a state. And this allowed senators to argue that that should be the case for both New Mexico and Utah, which is precisely what the second part of what the final part of the Compromise of 1850 said, was that Utah and New Mexico, even though they were territories and thereby subject to the federal government, their local legislatures were allowed to decide on whether or not to legalize slavery. And as the decade would move on, they actually would. Remember, 1859 is when New Mexico legalized slavery, and 54 is technically when it became legal, but they passed the act in 1853 in Utah. So this meant that people, especially slave owners, had a reason to go into these southern territories and basically upset that vote, that they would move into these territories in order to make the territory a slave state or a slave territory. So this seemed like a good way of stemming off the tide in terms of all the problems with this. Now there's a heavy hand in terms of how to deal with fugitive slaves. They had basically broken the Underground Railroad, which realized the Underground Railroad wasn't really a clear network or anything. It was a haphazard network at best, and a lot of historians actually argue that it was mostly used as abolitionist propaganda, that there weren't actually that many slaves gaining freedom through it, but it was used as a way of scaring slave owners into acting irrationally. But there's, of course, the other argument that it was, secretive for a reason, and that there were actually more slaves than is often thought of. So there's a huge argument as to how good how effective the Underground Railroad actually was. But the Fugitive Slave Act kind of broke its back, because now northern officials are required to work with slave catchers. So getting into the north didn't necessarily mean you were going to get all the way to Canada if you were running away from your owner. So there's all the fighting over fugitive slaves is basically over, and now there's a mechanism for dealing with what to do about the Missouri Compromise, because if we go back, we can see that Utah actually isn't within the Missouri Compromise. Utah's right around here, um, and Utah actually extended all the way over here in 1861. Um, the creation of Colorado would come in 1861, but that's during the Civil War. Um, but and Utah extended all the way to what is now Nevada, and Nevada also would be a creation of the Civil War, um, as a state as well, which we'll get to next week. But the you can see that's definitely outside of the Missouri Compromise. So they had kind of broken the Missouri Compromise with the Compromise of 1850, but it seemed to deal with the tensions of the time. But the key word is seemed, because it wasn't a fix. um, so this idea of popular choice for slavery meant that abolitionists had to hike up their rhetoric. And so, for instance, in 1852, a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, was released. It was actually based on, there was this was a fictional book about the horrors of slavery, but it was actually kind of based on a book called American Slavery as It Is, back in 1839, which was a bunch of stories um, about about the what's how bad slavery could get. You know, and it really that American Slavery as It Is was really a work of sensationalism, that it was trying to say that, like, um trying to emphasize the worst aspects possible. um and Stowe built that into the book, so of course Southerners um really didn't like the book. um and there was a huge backlash against it. Pamphlet after pamphlet was saying, like, this is not what slavery is. You are misrepresenting it with the worst possible aspects of it. um and you know and so of course she responded a year later with with a key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, um and explaining where she got the ideas from, you know admitting that it was sensational, and saying, so be it, anything to get rid of slavery. um and the and another book that came out that same year was the American Slave Code in Theory and Practice, um, which reinforced a lot of the key claims of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Basically saying that, like, yeah, there's laws to stop owners from slave owners from beating their slaves too much and overly abusing them, but is that really are they actually following those laws? Is there any enforcement? And this book argued no, that in fact slavery is even crueler than we thought. um you know the And this one was based on a lot of testimonials that were cited. So it had a lot of staying power in the North, even though in the South it was not just uh, not just denied, but actually pretty thoroughly debunked, because most of the testimonials were fake. So um, you know there's this rhetoric going back and forth about how bad slavery is, um and you know the northern the well, not just the northerners, but the abolitionists are especially vitriolic, because they think anything is okay to get rid of slavery, that lying is okay. and Southerners are saying, no, slavery's good. So you have this back and forth. Um, so with all of that, um, you have the debate over whether or not to legalize it in New Mexico and Utah. Utah, of course, does it first, despite all of this rhetoric surrounding Uncle Tom's Cabin. And New Mexico eventually does it. Plus, remember we talked the last time about filibusters, which I believe this will be on the quiz today, so pay attention. Filibusters were going south and trying to take more territory, right? So you had one of the most prominent of these was Narciso Lopez, who tried to filibuster Cuba. And mind you, Cuba still had legal slavery because it was a Spanish possession. And so when he was trying to filibuster it, he was basically trying to make it another American slave state. And we'll find that most filibusters were actually pro-slavery. There'd actually be some filibusters in like Canada and that. For instance, there was a series of filibusters called the Hunters Lodges in the 1830s that tried to take advantage of some rebellions up in Canada, and that wasn't really that was just about gaining more territory rather than trying to extend slavery. But these filibusters, especially in the 1850s, were often pro-slavery. And Narciso Lopez in 1851 published a big spread in a newspaper saying, citizens of the Republic, as in the USA, you are going to give to Cuba that freedom for which your example has taught her. Despite Cuba being a possession of Spain and having legal slavery, he was talking about freedom from Spain, not freedom from slavery. So you have all of that going on. And when he tried to go in 1851, the invasion was rebuffed. And he and a good chunk of the people trying to invade Cuba were captured. Although he was definitely executed as a pirate, because filibusters are essentially land pirates. He actually did instill a movement for rebelling against Spain in Cuba. In fact, they would adopt his flag as a result of all of this, which is currently the flag of Cuba. The flag of Cuba has a star on it, and that star actually represents that they wanted to be annexed by the United States. So there's a long history of filibuster stars on flags that it's kind of fascinating. But the meaning changed over time. But this is also where we actually start seeing the morphing of the term filibuster, because you guys have probably heard of filibusters in the Senate. Well, argument over Narciso Lopez's movement in filibuster expedition ended up seeing time on the Senate floor by one of its chief proponents, John Quitman, who eventually became Mississippi's governor. And so, well, he was Mississippi's governor at this point. He would become a House member after this. So this is actually where we start seeing the term filibuster start morphing into what we think of today. But for the rest of this, we're talking about military filibusters, as in people doing private expeditions to try to take over territory. And of course, the most notable and successful of these was William Walker, who managed to take over Nicaragua for a couple of years. In the process of that, he actually legalized slavery. So you could see all of these are pretty pro-slavery, and even though William Walker would actually argue that he wasn't pro-slavery, when he took over Baja California, he instituted the Louisiana codes, which technically legalized slavery in Baja California under his command. So, you know, take everything he had to say with a grain of salt. Um, and the guy was kind of full of himself, to say the least. Especially if you ever go and read his book on Nicaragua, it's hilarious how full of himself he is. Um, the the But he ends up running afoul of an American um, millionaire by the name of Vanderbilt, and because he was going to nationalize the railroads in Nicaragua, and mind you, the the first transcontinental railroad was created during this period in what is now Panama. At that point was Colombia, but it was completed in 1855. So that's the railroads in Nicaragua are a key part of this whole system, and especially all the people sailing down there, taking the railroad across the isthmus, and then heading up to California. So even though Nicaragua seems like a really far-flung place, it's not so much during the sectional crisis. He was defeated by all the people surrounding all the different countries surrounding the area, fled back to the U.S. for a little bit, organized another expedition into Honduras, but the British consulate basically ratted him out, and he was captured and executed on the beach. So goes William Walker. But there's a rumor that he might have been part of another batch of filibusters that was growing in the late 1850s called the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, this is a group that, while they technically formed in 1854, they were not really a clear-cut organization. They had a couple of attempts on Sonora, coming from Texas, that they tried to invade Sonora from not Sonora, Coahuila from Texas, but that failed. They also tried to funded some of these other expeditions that went into northern Mexico. But their basic idea was that they were going to create a ring of slave states throughout the Caribbean. That essentially this golden circle was all of Latin America. That they would take over everything from Mexico down to Nicaragua, and then work their way back up through all the islands and make the Caribbean a golden circle of slave states, U.S. slave states. Obviously, that never happened, and there's a lot of debate as to how extensive the organization actually was, hence why you can even see people arguing that William Walker was a member. But you can see there's like actual fighting that is going on to extend slavery. But back in the U.S., what really brought a lot of this stuff to a head, because realize we're still functioning under the Compromise of 1850 here. That, remember we had talked about like Kansas and Nebraska and that? Well, something had to break to make that possible. And that was the Pacific Railroad Survey. So from 1853 to 1855, the U.S. Army did a whole bunch of surveys throughout the West trying to figure out what was the best route for a transcontinental railroad. Um, there were many routes, trying to figure out which way would be best. You had a northern route that went through the Great Pass that were discovered by Lewis and Clark, basically following their path. Um, there was a central path that would take it through the Sierra Nevadas and get a much more direct route to the gold fields, but also was probably the most treacherous route of them all. Um, since they had to go through the Sierra Nevadas, which were notoriously difficult to pass through. For instance, in 1842, there had been a batch of people who had been taking the California Trail to Sutter's Fort, and had gotten stuck in the snow there, and resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. This party is called the Donner Party. And they got stuck in the mountains in California. If you're going between Sacramento and Reno today, there's actually a park that is dedicated to the grounds where the Donner Party was left, and it's known as Donner Pass, all because of that famous instance of cannibalism. But ultimately, that would actually be the path that the first transcontinental took. But there was a even better southern route that could be used throughout the year without worry of snow, and was would go over a lot more flat land. The Southern Pacific is what that would become. But the argument over which route to take ended up taking sectional qualities, because if it took the southern route, then it would reinforce the slavery, that people would be able to extend slavery a lot more easily if they had a railroad. And so the railroad survey became a sectional issue. It actually partially led to the Gadsden Purchase, because was to gain all that land so that there would be a good route for the Southern Pacific Railroad. So people were trying to figure out a way of compromising on this when a senator named Stephen A. Douglas, and this guy's going to come up a lot, Stephen Douglas proposed that that popular sovereignty be extended to northern territories, specifically the about to be organized Kansas and Nebraska territories. So in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, he managed to get the Congress to basically vote to abolish the Missouri, or what was the tattered remains of the Missouri Compromise altogether, in order to safeguard a possible northern route of the railroad. Of course, when the Pacific Railroad Survey was completed in 1855, the person in charge of the Army at that point was a guy named Jefferson Davis, who would eventually become the president of the Confederacy, so you can guess where his sympathies lie. And he, of course, recommended the Southern route. Now, arguably, the Southern route actually was the best route because it could be operated all throughout the year, and was safer to build, so it could be done quicker and cheaper. Plus, it went through a lot of land that nobody cared about anyways. So the idea of disrupting land rights wasn't that big of a deal either. All of that being said, it didn't matter which route was the best route as an actual route. What mattered was whether it would reinforce slavery. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act is where we see the next step of all this. which allowed for popular sovereignty, which of course meant that people from the neighboring states, especially Missouri, started flooding into Kansas, which led to Bleeding Kansas. Now, Bleeding Kansas is its own mess that could take an entire class. And notice we have John Brown again. Um, but essentially, you had all of these guys coming in from Missouri trying to disrupt the. Well, it's not really disrupting if it's perfectly legal and they're settling. But they were trying to send enough people into Kansas to make it a slave state. But in fact, the first constitution that they drafted for the territory was in 1855, which specifically stated that it would be a free soil territory. So the pro-slavery people within Kansas boycotted it altogether, basically making it an illegal constituent assembly, and therefore Congress demanded that a new constitution be made. And in the process of this made the Kansas issue a huge problem, and this guy named Charles Sumner in Congress specifically started railing against the pro-slavery elements of Congress, saying that the South was trying to take the free and fair elections of Kansas away. So a Southern senator came up to him by the name of Preston Brooks and started beating the utter crud out of him with his cane. It's known as the caning of Sumner. And on the Senate floor. So this is suddenly becoming really nasty to the point that senators are beating each other on Congress floor. And in fact, Sumner would end up spending something like a year and a half in bed because of how badly beaten he was. But because Brooks managed to break his cane over Sumner, Southern states started sending him a bunch of spare canes to basically show support of this beating, because he was defending Southern honor. You could see how the violence of slavery ends up multiplying itself in even its owners. So at the national level, you have violence, but also on the local level, it gets really nasty. So the border ruffians are the people coming in from Missouri and that, who end up fighting with the people who are coming in from the north, who are anti-slavery, who are known as jayhawkers. There's, of course, peaceful elements, but this got really, really bloody, hence why it's called Bleeding Kansas. And the debate over whether or not Kansas would be a free or slave state ended up killing a lot of people. The Jayhawkers, or Redlegs, they're sometimes called as Redlegs, were essentially guerrilla fighters as opposed to the border ruffians who had well-established homesteads and that. So keep that in mind. But in 1856, in response to all this constitutional problems, the border ruffians raided Lawrence, Kansas, and burned several abolitionist presses. Remember what happened to Joseph Smith, the Mormon leader, because he ordered the destruction of a press. So this is a big deal that they're literally destroying news presses. They also burnt down the Free State Hotel. And even though no one was actually injured except for a border ruffian who ended up basically burning himself alive. Um, but oh wait, no, he. There was 3 border ruffians who burnt themselves but survived, and one who shot himself in the leg and died a few days later. Um, oops. So the actual casualties from the sacking of Lawrence were border ruffians, the people doing the sacking. Um, but obviously, this sets a bad precedent, and suddenly Kansas is now in a state of war. That essentially, Northerners are now willing to start sending funds and rifles. So this guy named John Beecher, who's a Northern Unitarian, and remember, Unitarians are very anti-slavery, um, starts sending what are called Beecher Bibles. And he'd send crates of these things marked Bibles, and what it actually contains were Sharps rifles. So you could see a Sharps rifle right here in John Brown's hand. That's that's a that's actually a later Sharps rifle. The painter got this inaccurately, but of course there's a flag that didn't exist yet in this painting, so you know. Um, but yeah, now you have Northern preachers sending stuff, and so you get one of those Northern preachers, a guy who had failed his way through life up until that point, um, a guy named John Brown, the guy pictured here. He actually didn't have a beard at this point, but the John Brown was had tried to go to Harvard for I mean, no, he had tried to go to Yale to become a Unitarian preacher, and he had failed out of that. He also had lost a great deal of money in the Jacksonian crash, so he was kind of just failing in life um, until he got the call, shall we say, to go and fight this holy war against slavery. And one of the first things he does is find a batch of people who are supposedly pro-slavery, and he claimed were part of the sacking of Lawrence, though no, they weren't. Like, beyond a shadow of a doubt, they were not. Um, but took took out the families nearby and forced them to watch as he hacked the family to pieces. Um, this is called the Potawatomi Massacre. Um, so this happened in May of 1856, and he killed 5 pro-slavery civilians, um, and actually did this in front of their families. So this is particularly brutal. And Brown even took 23 border ruffians hostage at one point, to basically sell back to border ruffians, and ended up getting in a shootout over that as well. So he continued to be a very violent presence, and really amping up the stakes. Now, technically, the border ruffians were the first to move on this, but remember, they ended up hurting themselves more in the confusion. The so as all of this fighting is going on, there is some attempts to create a constitution, but the problem is there were pro-slavery constitutions and anti-slavery constitutions. So in December of 1857, there was a fraudulent vote to create the Lecompton Constitution, which was a pro-slavery constitution. It had the same fraud as the earlier Topeka one, but even with less votes. So it was less real, but actually the president at the time, James Buchanan, supported it, and wanted the Constitution to go through. But of course, Stephen Douglas, the guy who had created the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the first place, opposed it, so it didn't go through Congress. There was another one in January of 1858 that was pro slavery, but that didn't go through either. And so all this fighting continued throughout the period. There were a bunch of minor skirmishes throughout 1857 and 58, taking around 100 lives. So, we see all of this going on, and kind of the last of these fights was a massacre of free staters that, basically a response to the Potawatomi massacre, but this time they killed 5 people by shooting him in the back of the head and throwing him in a ditch. This is the Murray de Cygnus massacre. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. But you can see there is a lot of fighting going on. And so finally, in April of 1858, the first of the constitutions that would actually go somewhere was the Leavenworth Constitution, which was adopted as a free state constitution, but not approved by Congress. And so, because of basically some bad language in it, you have to have a constitution that works. And so, finally in October of 1859, the Wyandotte Constitution was adopted, and this made Kansas a free state. So eventually, the Jayhawkers won, though John Brown, for instance, had basically made himself anathema in the territory and had to run away to Massachusetts, where he would plan further fighting. You can see John Brown's kind of to put it in the words of Henry David Thoreau, he was the filibuster of abolition. Remember, the filibusters were mostly pro-slavery, but John Brown, being a violent individual, basically a terrorist, was fine with that label, and actually Thoreau meant that in a positive light, that it was a good thing. So the fighting there had basically ended, but actually during the Civil War there would be further fighting with what were called bushwhackers, that the Confederate Congress actually paid for guerrillas to go into Kansas and basically start up bleeding Kansas again. But for now, in 1859, it was done. But by that time, the slavery debate had moved on to other topics. So there were a whole bunch of legislative decision that basically there was a lot of argument over this, and a lot of movement kind of towards pro-slavery, that the U.S. became more and more pro-slavery throughout the period, and the problem being that Northerners did not like slavery, and many of them found it to be abhorrent despite all the pro-slavery rhetoric. So in 1854, remember the whole filibuster into into Cuba. Austin wrote a manifesto saying that the U.S. should invade Cuba. Although, interestingly enough, the manifesto might contain William Austin's name, but it actually was probably written by James Buchanan. So you could see James Buchanan was actually pretty pro-slavery, despite the fact that Democrats were not actually the party of slavery yet. That they became the party of slavery through all of this. specifically through through these issues being raised. So there was this movement to either buy or take by force Cuba, um, but it never got enacted, and Cuba remained free, remained Spanish all the way until 1898. But you can see the U.S. is already looking at ways of taking it away from Spain. Um, but that was part of the sectional crisis, that there was this issue that Cuba had legal slavery, and thereby, if we were to annex it, that slavery would remain. But then, where this really came to the fore was the Dred Scott decision of 1857. So it very clearly stated that, quote, a free Negro of the African race whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves is not a citizen, that's in air quotes, within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States. When the Constitution was adopted, they were not regarded in any of the states as members of the community which constituted the state, and were not numbered among its people or citizens. Consequently, the special rights and immunities guaranteed to citizens do not apply to them. And not being citizens within the meaning of the Constitution, they are not entitled to sue in that character in the court of the United States. Basically, this decision said that Black people were not citizens, that even free people, if they had been freed, were not citizens and did not have the right to sue in court. This basically eliminated the ability of people who might have moved with their slaves to a free state. Remember, there was a bunch of that where they would basically indenture their slaves and move them to a free state, thereby they weren't enslaved anymore, but still had no right to appeal. But the way to get out of that was to sue. Now they couldn't even do that. So this is functionally extended slavery into the free states. So you could guess there was a bit of opposition to it. And so you could see there's this kind of from the Kansas-Nebraska Act to the Austin Manifesto to the Dred Scott decision. You can see this steady movement of pro-slavery sentiment, even though Senator Douglas said that his Kansas-Nebraska Act was specifically so that there could be a northern route of the Transcontinental Railroad. It showed a steady movement of pro-slavery sentiment in the U.S. And so his local constituency did not like that so much. And especially a young politician, well, he wasn't really young, a middle-aged politician by the name of Abraham Lincoln decided to challenge Douglas for his Senate seat. And so they decided to hold a series of debates throughout Illinois over this. And Lincoln basically blamed the continuing pro-slavery sentiment in the U.S. all on Douglas, that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a conspiracy to extend slavery, and that he was working with the Supreme Court to eventually enact the Dred Scott decision and make freedom impossible in any state. This, of course, was a conspiracy theory and completely false, but it held some sway, even though not enough for Lincoln to actually win the debates, because he did not gain the seat. But in the process of this, And by the way, that quote that we had talked about back in the slavery lecture, where Lincoln was basically saying that like black people could never be equal because they're subhuman. This is a result of this debate that he eventually had to backpedal on all of these anti-slavery claims because the crowds just kept booing him over and over and over again, and every time he said anything about the equality of black people. So that's actually him backpedaling, not him. It well, you could argue whether or not you think that he took it seriously, but he contradicts himself a lot because he's a politician. Um, and so the uh, the uh, the Lincoln Douglas debates became this kind of focal point on pro and anti-slavery rhetoric, and Douglas kind of um, gave himself an Achilles heel for the future, where he said, no matter what the decision of the Supreme Court may be on that abstract question, as in like whether or not a slave owner can take his slave into a free state and still be a slave owner, um, still the right of the people to make a slave territory or a free territory is perfect and complete. So he basically shot himself in the foot by saying, I don't regard the Dred Scott decision to be constitutional. And we'll see that really does shoot himself in the foot. It's called the Freeport Doctrine because that's where that debate was held. It was actually a series of debates and really long debates. The shot in the foot was basically that he was saying that the extension of slavery couldn't happen if a state says no, but the Supreme Court said that no, it's the slave owner's property rights, and there is the requirement of states to regard each other's laws as true, so you couldn't actually extend it. In fact, the same arguments are made about like the extension of the end of miscegenation and anti-miscegenation laws, or Boogerfield v. Hodges is a perfect example of this, where they say that like because some states have legal gay marriage, then all states must regard that as true. It's the same argument. So legally speaking, they might actually have a point, but Douglas was saying, screw that. No, it's up to the states. Well, we'll see in later stuff that this is going to be the kind of needle in the side of the Democratic Party that will eventually lead to the Civil War. But we are running out of time, so let's see here. Let's stop the share. There we go. Before we go, we only have a couple minutes left. So any questions? Anybody? No?
It's kind of unrelated, but is that where like the Kansas Jayhawks got their name from?
Yes. Yeah, it is. In fact, there is still a rivalry between the University of Kansas and the University of Missouri. And when they have their big football game, it is literally called the Border War. Yeah, there's a lot of lingering effects of this even after the Civil War. But we'll get to the rest of the sectional crisis on Tuesday. If there are no other questions, then I will leave it at that. Have a good day, everyone.